The wind howled like a wounded beast across the frozen plains of Wyoming territory, carrying with it the promise of another merciless night. Snow fell in thick curtains, blanketing the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge in a deceptive shroud of white purity. Beyond the cluster of weathered buildings, the landscape stretched endlessly, rolling grasslands buried under winter's grip, distant mountains standing like silent sentinels against the gray sky. In a ramshackle cabin at the edge of town, Margaret Sullivan pressed her face against the frosted window, her breath forming small clouds that quickly crystallized on the glass. The year was 1887, and it had been 2 winters since cholera took her husband James, leaving her alone with their son, 7-year-old Thomas. The cabin groaned under the weight of snow on its roof, its walls offering little protection against the bitter cold that seeped through every crack and crevice. "Mama, I'm hungry," Thomas whispered from his makeshift bed near the dying embers of their fireplace. His voice, usually bright with childhood wonder, now carried the hollow echo of prolonged hunger. Margaret's heart clenched as she turned to face him. His cheeks, once round and rosy, had grown gaunt, his eyes too large in his small face. She forced a smile, though it felt like her facial muscles might crack from the effort. "I know, sweetheart. Mama's going to town to get us something to eat." She wrapped her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and pulled on boots that had seen better days, their soles worn thin and letting in the cold. The last of their flour had been used 3 days ago, the final strips of dried meat consumed yesterday morning. Pride had kept her from begging sooner, but pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The walk to town was treacherous, her feet sinking deep into fresh snowdrifts with each step. By the time she reached Main Street, her skirts were soaked through, ice forming along the hem. Cedar Ridge was bustling despite the weather, men loading supplies onto wagons, women hurrying between shops, children playing in the snow under watchful eyes. Margaret approached the general store first, pausing to smooth her dark hair and straighten her worn dress before entering. The warmth inside hit her like a physical force, making her realize just how cold she'd become. The store was filled with the scent of coffee, tobacco, and fresh bread, smells that made her stomach clench painfully. Behind the counter stood Hiram Fletcher, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and cold gray eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his tone making it clear she wasn't welcome. "What brings you here?" Margaret lifted her chin, clinging to what dignity remained. "Mr. Fletcher, I was hoping we might work out an arrangement. My boy and I. We need provisions." "I can work. Cleaning, mending, anything you need." Fletcher's laugh was harsh. "Work? Half the town's looking for work, and they ain't widows with young ones slowing them down." He leaned forward, his breath sour with chewing tobacco. "Besides, I seem to recall you already owe me for last month's flour." "Please," Margaret said, hating how the word tasted in her mouth. "Just a bit of bread. For my son." "Can't help you," Fletcher said, turning away. "Try the church. That's what charity's for." Margaret left the store, her cheeks burning despite the cold. She tried the bakery next, then the boarding house where she'd once done laundry. Each rejection was delivered with varying degrees of pity or contempt, but the result was the same. Empty hands, empty promises. At the church, Reverend Dawson's wife looked at her with pursed lips. "We've already distributed this week's charity meals," she said, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. "Perhaps if you attended services more regularly." The implication hung heavy in the air. Margaret had stopped attending church after James died, unable to sit through sermons about God's plan while her son grew hungrier each day. Now, it seemed, even God's mercy came with conditions. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Margaret stood in the town square, watching smoke rise from chimneys of homes where families gathered around laden tables. Her hands were numb, her feet beyond feeling. Through a window, she glimpsed the Hartley family at dinner, roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread. Mrs. Hartley had been her friend once, Before widowhood made Margaret a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. It was then she overheard two men talking near the livery stable. "That trader's back," one said, "the one who deals with the Comanche. Brave or foolish. Trading with savages." The other replied, "Though I hear he's got grain to spare. Willing to trade for most anything. Most anything." The first man chuckled darkly. "Wonder what a Comanche would trade grain for." Margaret's pulse quickened. She'd heard whispers of this trader, a mysterious figure who moved between the world of the frontier towns and the Comanche territory. Some said he was half Indian himself. Others claimed he was a white man gone native. What all agreed on was that he had access to supplies when others didn't. Night had fallen by the time Margaret made her way to the old trading post on the outskirts of town, where the mysterious trader was said to conduct his business. The building stood apart from the others, as if the town itself wanted to keep its distance from anyone who dealt with Indians. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached, driven by desperation and the image of Thomas's hungry eyes. The trading post was dimly lit by oil lamps, casting long shadows across stacks of grain sacks, bundles of furs, and various trade goods. Behind a rough wooden counter stood a figure that made Margaret's breath catch. He was tall, with the powerful build of a warrior. His skin bronzed by sun and wind, long black hair fell past his shoulders, and his face bore the sharp, dignified features of the Comanche people. He wore a mix of traditional and frontier clothing, leather leggings, a cotton shirt, a vest decorated with beadwork. His dark eyes found hers as she entered, and something in his steady gaze made her falter. This was no ordinary trader. This was a man who had seen both worlds and chosen to walk between them. "You need something," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep, accented but clear. Margaret's mouth was dry. She'd prepared words on the walk here, but now they seemed to stick in her throat. The weight of what she was about to offer, the last thing she had to give, pressed down on her like the winter snow. "I need bread," she finally managed. "Grain, anything. My son." Her voice broke. The Comanche warrior studied her for a long moment. "You have trade." Margaret shook her head, then steeled herself. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached up to loosen her shawl. I can offer—" The words were agony. "Myself." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Margaret stood there, exposed not in body but in spirit, her desperation laid bare. She waited for him to accept, to take what so many men would have grabbed without hesitation. Instead, his expression shifted, not to desire or greed, but to something she couldn't quite name. "No," he said quietly. Margaret felt her face flame with humiliation. Was she so wretched that even this last, desperate currency was worthless? Then he spoke again, his words stopping her as she turned to flee. "I do not want your body," the Comanche warrior said, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her freeze. "I want your heart." Margaret stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend his words. The shawl slipped from her trembling fingers back onto her shoulders. She had prepared herself for degradation, for the loss of what little dignity remained to her, but not for this. Not for rejection that somehow felt more intimate than acceptance would have been. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the trading post windows. The Comanche warrior moved from behind the counter with fluid grace. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the small scar on his left cheek. He reached for something on a shelf and returned with a cloth-wrapped bundle. The smell of fresh bread made her knees weak. "Take this," he said, pressing the bundle into her hands. "Feed your son." Margaret stared at the bread, then at him. "But I haven't, you said—" "Go home," he interrupted gently. "Your child needs you." Shame washed over her in waves. She had offered the only thing she thought had value, and he had refused it. Yet here she stood with bread in her hands, charity she hadn't earned. The humiliation was complete. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt like sand in her mouth. She turned and fled into the night, clutching the bundle against her chest. The walk home was a blur of snow and tears. Margaret's mind reeled with confusion and mortification. What kind of man refused what she had offered? What did he mean, wanting her heart? The bread grew heavy in her arms, weighted with obligations she didn't understand. Thomas was asleep when she entered the cabin, curled into a small ball beneath their only quilt. Margaret built up the fire with their last pieces of wood and unwrapped the bundle with shaking hands. Inside was not just bread but dried meat, a small sack of cornmeal, and, her breath caught, a handful of peppermint sticks. She woke Thomas gently. "Sweetheart, Mama brought food." His eyes flew open, bright with disbelief and joy. "Really?" As she watched him eat, trying to make him slow down, take small bites. Margaret felt the tears come again, but these were different tears, gratitude mixed with bewilderment, relief tangled with dread. She had crossed a line tonight, revealed the depths of her desperation, and somewhere in Cedar Ridge, a Comanche warrior knew exactly how far she had been willing to fall. Morning brought whispers. Margaret ventured out to gather firewood and felt the weight of stares from neighbors who had previously ignored her. "Mrs." Henderson pulled her daughter closer as they passed. "Mr." Campbell spat tobacco juice in her direction, his message clear. "At the general store," where she'd gone to see if anyone needed mending done. Hiram Fletcher's voice carried clearly to where she waited outside. "That Sullivan woman was seen at the trading post last night, alone, with that savage. Lord knows what she did for food." Another voice added, "Shameful, if you ask me." Margaret's face burned, but she forced herself to walk past with her head high. Let them talk. Thomas had eaten breakfast for the first time in days. That was all that mattered. But the whispers followed her home, crept through the thin walls of her cabin, and settled like frost in her heart. By afternoon, Reverend Dawson's wife had come calling, her face a mask of false concern. "My dear Mrs. Sullivan," she said, not waiting to be invited in. "I've heard the most distressing rumors." Margaret kept her hand steady as she continued mending a torn shirt, one of the few pieces of work she'd managed to secure. "I'm sure you have, Mrs. Dawson. Associating with those heathens is dangerous, both for your soul and your reputation." The woman's eyes glinted with righteous fervor. "Whatever desperation drove you there, surely there are more. Appropriate ways to seek help. The appropriate ways turned me away." Margaret said quietly, "Mrs." Dawson's mouth pursed. "Perhaps that was God's way of testing your faith, turning to savages in your time of need. What example does that set for your son?" After the woman left, trailing disapproval like perfume, Margaret sat in the gathering dusk and wondered if she'd made everything worse. The bread was nearly gone. The cornmeal wouldn't last the week. What then? She couldn't go back to the trading post, not after. A soft thud outside made her jump, heart racing. She opened the door to find another bundle on her doorstep. Fresh tracks led away into the darkness. Moccasin prints, not boots. Inside the bundle, more bread, beans, salt pork, and a small pouch of coffee. Margaret stared out into the night but saw no one. The wind had already begun to erase the tracks, as if the visit had been a dream. She brought the bundle inside, her hands shaking for entirely different reasons than hunger. This pattern continued for several days. She would find packages at dawn or dusk, never seeing who left them, though she knew. The gifts were practical. Food, firewood, a pair of small mittens that fit Thomas perfectly. Each one felt like a weight added to a debt she didn't understand how to repay. The town's hostility grew with each passing day. Work she'd been promised disappeared. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Men made crude jokes just loud enough for her to hear. Thomas came home from playing with a bloody nose, refusing to say which boy had called his mother a squaw lover. One evening, as snow fell heavy and silent, Margaret stood at her window and saw him. The Comanche warrior stood at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the swirling white. He was watching her cabin, making no effort to hide, when their eyes met across the distance. He inclined his head slightly, then melted back into the forest. That night, she lay awake thinking about his words. I want your heart. What could that mean from a man who asked nothing in return for his gifts, who kept his distance, yet ensured she and Thomas didn't starve? The phrase turned over and over in her mind like a smooth stone in her pocket. The next morning brought a blizzard and a pounding at her door. Sheriff Watson stood on her doorstep, his badge glinting dully in the gray light. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, touching his hat brim. I'm here about your activities. My activities? She kept her voice level, though her heart hammered. You've been seen accepting goods from that Comanche trader. There's concern about what kind of arrangements you might have made. His eyes traveled over her cabin, lingering on the stack of firewood she couldn't have gathered alone. Cedar Ridge is a God-fearing town. We can't have women engaging in improper relations. There's nothing improper. That's to be determined. Watson interrupted. I'm warning you, ma'am. Stay away from that savage. We've tolerated his trading because times are hard. But if he's preying on desperate women... He let the threat hang unfinished. After he left, Margaret sank into a chair, trembling with rage and fear. Preying on desperate women? The only predators she'd encountered wore familiar faces and spoke familiar words. The warrior had shown her more kindness than her own people. Yet, accepting that kindness might cost her everything. That night, no bundle appeared. The blizzard raged for 2 days, trapping them inside as their food dwindled. Thomas grew quiet, sensing his mother's fear. Margaret found herself watching for moccasin prints that never came, wondering if the sheriff's visit had driven away their benefactor. On the 3rd night, when the storm finally exhausted itself, she made a decision, wrapping herself in every layer she owned. Margaret ventured out into the crystalline silence that follows a blizzard. The moon was full, turning the snow-covered landscape into a world of silver and shadow. She didn't have to go far. He was waiting at the trading post, as if he'd known she would come. You stopped, she said without preamble. He studied her face in the moonlight. The sheriff came to you. Yes. You have trouble because of me. Margaret laughed, surprising them both with its bitterness. I had trouble before you. Starving is its own kind of trouble. Your people don't understand. My people? She shook her head. They stopped being my people when my husband died and I became a burden. They stood in silence for a moment, the cold sharp and clean around them. Finally, he spoke. My name is Joseph Standing Bear. My mother was Comanche. My father was a missionary who loved her enough to leave his world behind. The revelation hung between them, explaining so much. His ability to move between worlds, his isolation from both. I'm Margaret, she offered, though he probably knew already. Margaret, he said it carefully, as if tasting the syllables. Your heart is strong, stronger than you know. Is that why? She asked. Why you said what you said? Joseph's eyes held depth she was only beginning to understand. A body can be taken or given away, but a heart must be earned, and it must choose to be given. Standing there in the moonlight, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. The shame she'd carried began to transform into something else, not quite understanding. Not yet, but the beginning of it. This man had seen her at her lowest moment and had chosen to preserve not just her life, but her dignity. Thank you, she said. And this time the words came easier. Joseph reached behind the counter and produced another bundle. For your son, he said. As she took it, their fingers brushed, the first time they'd touched. The contact was brief but electric, leaving her skin tingling beneath her gloves. Walking home through the silver darkness, Margaret realized the weight on her chest had changed. It was still there, but different, less like shame, more like possibility. Behind her, she knew Joseph Standing Bear watched until she reached her door safely, and for the first time since James died, she didn't feel entirely alone. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Wyoming territory. though the cold still bit deep and snow lingered in the shadows of buildings and trees. Margaret found herself watching for Joseph Standing-Bear without meaning to, catching glimpses of him at the edge of town, recognizing his tracks in the snow near her cabin. He kept his distance but remained present, like a guardian spirit from the old stories her grandmother used to tell. She learned more about him through fragments and whispers. Some said he'd left his mother's people after refusing to join a raid on white settlers. Others claimed he'd been cast out for defending a captured white woman. The stories varied, but all agreed on one point. Joseph Standing-Bear walked between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. One morning, while gathering deadwood in the forest behind her cabin, Margaret heard the low growl that made every frontier person's blood freeze. A wolf, lean from winter and desperate, emerged from behind a fallen log, its yellow eyes fixed on her with predatory intent. Margaret gripped her gathering stick, knowing it would be useless against the starving animal. The wolf tensed to spring, and an arrow whistled through the air, striking true. The animal collapsed, and Joseph materialized from the trees as if he'd been formed from shadow and snow. "You should not come alone to the woods," he said, pulling his arrow free with practiced efficiency. Margaret's heart still raced. "I needed firewood. Thomas is sick with cold, and I will help," he interrupted, already moving to gather the scattered branches she'd dropped. His movements were economical, efficient. Within minutes, he'd collected more usable wood than she could have managed in an hour. As they walked back toward her cabin, Margaret found herself studying him sideways. "You've been watching over us. The woods are dangerous." "That's not what I mean." Joseph paused, adjusting the bundle of wood on his shoulder. "Your people make you suffer for accepting my help. This is wrong." "They're afraid," Margaret said, surprising herself by defending those who scorned her. "They don't understand. Fear makes people cruel." Joseph said simply, "I have seen this in both worlds." At her cabin, Thomas peered through the window, his face brightening despite his fever when he saw their visitor. Margaret hesitated at the door. Inviting Joseph inside would cement every rumor, destroy any chance of redemption in the town's eyes. But Thomas was coughing, and the man beside her had just saved her life. "Come in," she said. "Let me at least make you coffee." Joseph's presence filled the small cabin. He set the firewood by the hearth and built up the fire with skilled hands while Margaret heated water. Thomas watched from his bed with bright, curious eyes. "Are you really an Indian?" the boy asked with childhood directness. "Thomas," Margaret admonished, but Joseph held up a hand. "Half," he told the child. "My mother was Comanche. My father was white. Can you shoot a bow and arrow? Can you track animals? Do you live in a teepee?" Joseph's serious face softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, yes, and no. I live in a cabin, like you." As Margaret served coffee, using the last of what Joseph had given her, she watched the two interact. Thomas's innocent questions drew out stories of hunting, of the plains before the railroad, of a world that was rapidly disappearing. Joseph spoke carefully, choosing tales that wouldn't frighten a child, and Margaret found herself drawn into his words. "My mother's people believe the earth is our grandmother," Joseph said. "She provides for us, but we must respect her. Take only what we need." "Is that why you help us?" Thomas asked. "Because we need?" Joseph's eyes found Margaret's across the small space. "Sometimes people need more than food and wood. Sometimes they need to know they are not alone." After he left, Thomas fell into a peaceful sleep, his fever breaking. Margaret sat by the fire, replaying the afternoon in her mind. The warrior's presence had made her cabin feel safer, warmer, not just from the wood he'd brought, but from something less tangible. Days passed. The hostile looks in town continued, but Margaret found them easier to bear. She had work mending clothes for a few families who cared more about her neat stitches than her reputation. It wasn't much, but combined with Joseph's discreet help, they were surviving. One afternoon, while Thomas played with pine cones near the cabin, Mrs. Adelaide Morrison approached. Adelaide had been one of the few to show Margaret kindness after James died, though she'd kept her distance lately. "Margaret," she said, glancing around nervously. "I need to speak with you." Margaret set aside her mending. "Come in, Adelaide." The woman shook her head. "No, People talk, but I wanted to warn you. There's a group of men, led by Silas Blackwood. They're saying that Indian, that traitor, he's corrupting decent women. They want to run him off." Margaret's blood chilled. "When?" "Soon, maybe tonight. They're getting liquored up at the saloon, working up their courage." Adelaide grabbed Margaret's hands. "Whatever's between you two, it needs to stop. For your boy's sake, if not your own." After Adelaide hurried away, Margaret paced her cabin like a caged animal. Joseph had done nothing but show kindness. Yet he would pay for it with violence, possibly his life. The thought of him driven away, or worse, made her chest tight with panic. As dusk fell, she made a decision, telling Thomas to stay inside and bar the door. She wrapped her shawl tight and headed for the trading post. The streets were unusually quiet, shadows long and threatening. Every sound made her jump. She found Joseph preparing to leave, packing items into saddlebags. He looked up as she burst in, took in her flushed face and rapid breathing. "You know," she gasped. "I know." His voice was calm. "This is not my first time being unwelcome. You can't just leave. You've done nothing wrong. I have disrupted their peace, in their minds. That is wrong enough." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "Where will you go?" "West. There is always west." He continued packing with steady hands. "You will be safer when I am gone. They will forgive you in time." "Forgive me for what?" "For accepting kindness when they offered none. For not starving quietly like a good widow should." Joseph stopped, looking at her fully. "You are angry." "Yes, I'm angry. I'm furious." The words poured out like spring floodwater. "My husband worked himself to death trying to make a life here. These people attended his funeral, said pretty words about Christian charity. Then they left me and Thomas to freeze and starve. You, a stranger, someone they call savage. You showed us the only real compassion we've received, and now they'll hurt you for it. This is the way of things," Joseph said quietly. "Then the way of things is wrong." Margaret was crying now, weeks of suppressed emotion breaking free. "I won't let them." Her words were cut off by the sound of horses, many of them, and rough voices. Through the window, she could see torches, a dozen men or more, their faces ugly with righteous anger and whiskey. "Out back," Joseph said urgently. "Go! Not without you." Margaret. "No." She grabbed his arm, felt the solid strength beneath the cloth. "I won't run anymore. I won't hide." The door burst open. Silas Blackwood stood there, flanked by other men from town. His eyes were mean with drink, his hand on his pistol. Well, he drawled. "Caught in the act. Step away from him. Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret moved closer to Joseph instead. "The only act you've caught is conversation, Mr. Blackwood, though I doubt you'd recognize civilized behavior if it bit you." Blackwood's face darkened. "Your husband would be ashamed, seeing you carry on with this heathen. My husband would be ashamed to see how his neighbors treat his widow and child." Margaret shot back. "Enough talk," another man said. "We came here to deal with the Indian." Joseph stepped forward, putting himself slightly in front of Margaret. "I will leave. There needs be no trouble." "Oh, you'll leave all right." Blackwood sneered. "Question is whether you'll be walking or dragging." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Margaret could feel violence hovering in the air like smoke. These men had worked themselves up for blood, and reason would not reach them. Then, from outside, a small voice called out, "Mama!" Thomas stood in the doorway, having followed despite her instructions. His eyes were wide with fear as he took in the scene. The angry men, his mother's tears. Joseph standing protectively before her. "Get that brat out of here!" Blackwood snarled. Thomas ran, not away, but to Joseph, wrapping his thin arms around the warrior's leg. "Don't let them hurt him! Mama, he's our friend!" The sight of the child clinging to the man they'd come to punish gave some of the mob pause. In Thomas's innocent gesture was a truth that cut through their assumptions. This was not some predator corrupting a desperate woman, but a protector, a provider, a friend to the friendless. Joseph placed a gentle hand on Thomas's head, and in that moment, Margaret saw what he'd meant about wanting her heart. Not possession, not conquest, but connection, the simple human recognition of one soul by another, choosing to care despite the cost. "This changes nothing," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "It changes everything," Margaret said quietly. She moved to stand beside Joseph, taking Thomas's hand. "This man saved my son from starvation while you turned your backs. He protected me from a wolf while you gossiped about my virtue. He showed us kindness while you showed us judgment. If that makes him savage and you civilized, then I choose savagery." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own failures of charity. The momentum of the mob wavered, caught between shame and stubborn pride. The standoff at the trading post ended with grudging retreat, the mob's bloodlust cooled by Thomas's innocent intervention and Margaret's fierce words. But Blackwood's parting threat hung heavy in the air. "This ain't over, squaw man, not by a long shot." Joseph left Cedar Ridge that night despite Margaret's protests, promising only that he would not go far. The days that followed were tense with waiting. The town's hostility had sharpened into something more dangerous, no longer just cold shoulders and whispers, but open threats and violent promises. Margaret found dead rabbits on her doorstep, their necks twisted, clear warnings of what awaited those who betrayed their own kind. 3 nights later, she woke to rough hands and torchlight. 5 men stood in her cabin: Blackwood, Fletcher from the general store, and 3 others whose faces were masked by shadow and liquor. "Where is he?" Blackwood demanded, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. "I don't know what you mean," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady as Thomas whimpered from his bed. "Don't play dumb, woman. That savage has been sneaking around. We know you've been meeting him." "I haven't seen him since you ran him off." Fletcher backhanded her, sending her sprawling. "Lying Jezebel. Carl saw moccasin tracks by the creek yesterday. That heathen's still around, and you're going to tell us where." "Mama!" Thomas scrambled from his bed, but one of the men caught him, holding the struggling boy easily. "Maybe she needs proper motivation," the man holding Thomas suggested, his meaning clear. Terror clenched Margaret's heart. "Please, he's just a child." "Then tell us where your Indian lover is hiding." Blackwood snarled. Margaret's mind raced. She had seen Joseph yesterday. He'd left venison at the hollow tree they'd designated as a safe drop point, but she had no idea where he sheltered. Even if she did, she would die before betraying him to these animals. "I don't know," she said firmly. "Now let my son go." Wrong answer. Blackwood nodded to his men. "Take them both. Maybe a night in the cold will refresh her memory." They dragged Margaret and Thomas out into the freezing darkness. The boy fought with surprising ferocity for his size, biting and kicking until one of the men cuffed him hard enough to daze him. Margaret screamed, struggling against the hands that held her. But she might as well have fought the mountains themselves. They were heading for the old mine shaft. Everyone knew what happened to those who were taken there. The abandoned dig had become Cedar Ridge's unofficial site for the kind of justice that happened in darkness, away from even the pretense of law. Then, like something from the old stories, Joseph appeared. He came from the shadows, silent as smoke, his bow drawn. The arrow took the man holding Thomas through the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain. Before the others could react, Joseph had notched another arrow. "Let them go," he said quietly. "It's him." Fletcher went for his gun, but Joseph's arrow found his gun hand, sending the weapon spinning into the darkness. The clearing erupted in chaos. Blackwood shoved Margaret aside and charged Joseph with a roar. The 2 men collided with brutal force, rolling in the snow. The warrior's bow went flying. Another man jumped into the fray while the wounded tried to stem their bleeding. Joseph fought with deadly efficiency, but he was outnumbered. A vicious blow from a rifle butt sent him to his knees. Blackwood's boot caught him in the ribs, doubling him over. "Got you now, savage!" Blackwood panted, drawing his knife. "Gonna gut you like the animal you are." "No!" Margaret launched herself at Blackwood, clawing at his face. He backhanded her aside, but the distraction was enough. Joseph surged up, grabbing Blackwood's wrist and turning the knife away. The two men strained against each other, muscles locked in deadly contest. Thomas, freed in the chaos, ran to his mother. "We have to help him." Margaret grabbed a fallen branch, hefting it like a club. But before she could move, the sharp crack of a rifle split the night. Everyone froze. Sheriff Watson stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle pointed skyward, smoke still curling from the barrel. Behind him were several other men, including Reverend Dawson and, surprisingly, old Judge Campbell, wrapped in his nightrobe but carrying the authority of law in his stern face. "That's enough," Watson commanded. "Everyone stand down, now!" "Sheriff, this savage attacked us," Blackwood started. "I saw what happened. Silas." Judge Campbell interrupted, his voice cold as the winter wind. "I was awakened by the commotion and followed. I witnessed you and your thugs dragging a woman and child from their home." He looked at the wounded men with disgust. "Seems to me the only savage behavior here is yours. Your Honor, this woman's been consorting with whom she consorts is no business of yours or anyone else's, so long as no law is broken." The judge said firmly, "Last I checked, accepting charity and friendship wasn't a crime in Wyoming territory." Watson moved forward, keeping his rifle ready. "Joseph Standing Bear, you're under arrest." "What?" Margaret cried. "He was defending us." "I know," Watson said, not unkindly. "But he wounded 2 men. There's got to be due process." He looked at Joseph. "Will you come peacefully?" Joseph straightened slowly, blood running from a cut on his brow. His eyes found Margaret's. "Take care of your mother," he told Thomas. Then, to Watson, "I will come." "This is ridiculous." Margaret stepped forward, but Joseph shook his head slightly. "Trust the law," he said quietly, though his tone suggested he had little faith in it himself. As Watson led Joseph away, Judge Campbell turned to Blackwood and his men. "You boys are lucky I don't have you arrested too, breaking into a widow's home, threatening a child. What would your mothers think? She's no better than a whore." Fletcher spat through his pain. "Spreading her legs for a savage." The judge's cane cracked across Fletcher's face before he could finish. "That's a lady you're speaking of, you pig, and if I hear such filth from any of you again, you'll answer to me personally." After the men dispersed, some shamefaced and others still glowering, Judge Campbell turned to Margaret. "Are you hurt, my dear?" "No, sir, but Joseph—" "Will get a fair hearing? I'll see to it personally." The old man's eyes were kind but tired. "This town— Sometimes I wonder if civilization hasn't made us more savage than those we call by that name." Margaret spent the night holding Thomas, who cried himself to sleep asking when Joseph would come back. She had no answer. The territorial justice system was better than mob rule, but it still favored white men over Indians. Joseph had wounded 2 white citizens. That he'd done so defending a woman and child might not matter. Dawn brought unexpected visitors. Adelaide Morrison arrived with several other women, the minister's wife, the schoolteacher, even Mrs. Campbell. "We've come to help," Adelaide said simply. "What happened last night? It wasn't right." As the women helped clean up the ransacked cabin, Margaret learned that word of the night's events had spread. The image of armed men dragging a widow and child into the night had shaken something in the town's conscience. Not everyone approved of Margaret's friendship with Joseph, but fewer still approved of Blackwood's methods. "My husband's furious," Mrs. Campbell confided. "He's already sent word to the territorial capital. There'll be a proper trial, not some frontier mockery of justice." Days passed in anxious waiting. Margaret was allowed to visit Joseph once, finding him in the town jail bearing bruises but unbroken. Through the bars, their hands almost touched. "You should not have come back," she whispered. "You needed me," he replied simply. "That is enough." They could hang you. Perhaps, but you and Thomas are safe. That matters more. Margaret felt tears threaten. Why? Why risk everything for us? Joseph was quiet for a long moment. My father once told me that love is not words or feelings. Love is choosing to stand between danger and those who cannot stand alone. You stood for me that night at the trading post. How could I do less? Is that what this is? Margaret asked, her heart pounding. Love? His dark eyes met hers steadily. What else would you call it? The trial drew crowds from across the county. Word had spread of the Indian who defended a widow, and people came to gawk at the spectacle. Judge Campbell presided with stern dignity, allowing no theatrics from either side. Blackwood and Fletcher testified first, painting Joseph as a dangerous savage who'd attacked peaceful citizens. But under the judge's sharp questioning, their story began to fray. Why were 5 armed men at the widow Sullivan's cabin at night? What business did they have dragging her and her child from their home? When Margaret testified, she spoke with quiet dignity about Joseph's kindness, his protection, the food he'd provided when the town turned its back. Several women in the gallery wept as she described choosing between starvation and degradation, only to be met with unexpected compassion. Thomas, too young to be properly sworn in but allowed to speak, simply said, "Mr. Joseph saved us. He's good." Anyone who says different is lying. The defense presented character witnesses, traders who'd dealt honestly with Joseph for years. A rancher whose daughter Joseph had helped find when she was lost in a blizzard. Even a cavalry officer who testified that Joseph had once warned the fort about a planned raid, saving lives. But it was Judge Campbell's closing statement that carried the day. We sit here in judgment of a man who defended the defenseless. If that is a crime, then we must also condemn every tale of chivalry, every story of heroism we tell our children. The question before us is not whether Joseph Standing Bear is guilty of wounding those men. He freely admits it. The question is whether we, as a civilized people, will punish a man for doing what every decent human should do, protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The jury, 12 men, including some who'd initially supported Blackwood, deliberated for only an hour. Their verdict, justified defense. Joseph Standing Bear was free. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions, cheers from some, angry mutters from others. But Margaret heard none of it. She pushed through the crowd to where Joseph stood, still blinking in surprise at his freedom. Without thinking, without caring who saw, she threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for coming back." His arms came around her slowly, as if he was still learning how. Where else would I go? My heart is here. Spring came slowly to Wyoming territory. Melting snow revealing the damage winter had wrought. The trial's verdict had divided Cedar Ridge more deeply than before, while some citizens had been moved by the testimony to reconsider their prejudices. Others grew more entrenched in their hatred. Margaret found herself caught between two worlds, no longer fully ostracized but far from accepted. Joseph had returned to his solitary cabin in the woods, but the distance between them had changed. What had been furtive charity was now open friendship, though the word felt inadequate for the connection that hummed between them like a taut wire. When will Mr. Joseph visit again? Thomas asked for the 10th time that week, pressing his nose against the window. "I don't know, sweetheart," Margaret replied, though she too found herself watching the tree line. The answer came that afternoon when Joseph appeared at their door in broad daylight, no longer hiding in shadows. He carried fresh venison and something more, lumber balanced on his broad shoulders. "Your roof needs repair before the spring rains," he said simply, as if showing up to fix a widow's roof was the most natural thing in the world. Margaret knew she should protest, knew that accepting more help would fuel the gossips. But the practical part of her, the survivor, recognized necessity. "Thank you," she said instead. As Joseph worked, Thomas peppered him with questions about everything from tracking deer to the names of stars. The warrior answered patiently, sometimes demonstrating a skill or sketching in the dirt to illustrate a point. Margaret watched them together, feeling something dangerously close to contentment. "You're good with him," she said, bringing Joseph water. "He reminds me of my sister's son." Joseph replied, accepting the cup. Their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away immediately. "Curious about everything? Fearless as a wolf pup? You have family?" It occurred to Margaret how little she knew of his life beyond their interactions. "Had," Joseph corrected quietly. "Cholera took my sister 5 winters ago. Her husband blamed me, said I brought white man's sickness to them by trading with the settlements." He continued working, but she could see the old pain in the set of his shoulders. Perhaps he was right. "You can't blame yourself for disease," Margaret said firmly. "Can't I?" Joseph secured another board with practice strikes. "I chose to walk between worlds, knowing each side would blame me for the other's sins. My mother's people see a white man's pet. Your people see a savage. Neither is wrong. I see a good man," Margaret said softly. "Thomas sees a hero. Isn't that enough?" Joseph paused in his work to look at her fully. "You see too much good where there is none, and you see too little good where there is plenty." They stood there in the spring afternoon, understanding flowing between them like water finding its course. But the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, many of them. Silas Blackwood led the group, though he'd been careful to stay within the law this time. With him rode a dozen men, including some Margaret didn't recognize. They stopped just outside her property line, technically not trespassing. Well, Blackwood called out. "Looks like the savage is making himself right at home. How cozy." Joseph climbed down from the roof slowly, his hand drifting toward where his knife hung. Margaret stepped forward, putting herself partially between the men and her cabin where Thomas watched wide-eyed. "State your business, Mr. Blackwood, or move along," she said with more courage than she felt. "Oh, I've got business all right." Blackwood's smile was ugly. "Got a telegram this morning. Seems there's been Indian troubles up north, raids on settlements, stolen cattle, the usual savage behavior. Marshall's putting together a citizen militia to deal with it." "That has nothing to do with us," Margaret said. "Doesn't it?" Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle. "See, the Marshal wants all Indians rounded up for questioning. Can't be too careful when there's hostiles about. Your friend here being Comanche and all. Well," he shrugged with false casualness. "Might be he knows something about these raids." "The Comanche are 300 miles south of the Troubles," Joseph said calmly. "Different tribe, different territory. All look the same to me. Savage." Blackwood's hand rested on his pistol. "You can come peaceful for questioning, or we can do this the hard way. Judge Campbell ain't here to protect you now." Margaret felt Joseph tense beside her, calculating odds. 12 armed men against 1. Even he couldn't prevail against those numbers. But she knew he would try rather than submit to what would surely become a lynching disguised as law. "Wait," she said quickly. "He'll come, peacefully. Won't you, Joseph?" Their eyes met. She tried to communicate with her gaze. "Trust me, don't fight. We'll find another way." After a long moment, Joseph nodded. "I will come," he said. "But the boy and his mother stay here. They have done nothing." "Oh, I don't know about that." One of the men laughed. "Harboring a possible hostile? That's serious business." "Touch them and I'll kill you where you stand," Joseph said quietly. And something in his tone made even Blackwood's men shift nervously. "No one's touching anyone," Margaret said firmly. She turned to Blackwood. "You have what you came for. Joseph will come peacefully. I'll follow to town to ensure he arrives safely." Blackwood clearly wanted to refuse, but the memory of Judge Campbell's wrath stayed his hand. "Fine, but if he tries to run—" "He won't," Margaret said. As the men bound Joseph's hands, unnecessarily tight, she noted with anger. He spoke quietly in his native tongue. Margaret didn't understand the words, but Thomas did. The boy had been learning phrases from Joseph, and his face went pale. "Mama," Thomas whispered urgently. "He said to find the hollow tree, said there's something there we need." Margaret squeezed her son's shoulder in acknowledgement, her mind already racing. The hollow tree where they'd exchanged messages. What had Joseph left there? The ride to town was tense. Margaret followed on their old mule, Thomas clinging behind her. The men surrounding Joseph made crude jokes and threats, but the warrior remained stoic, his back straight despite the bonds. In town, word spread quickly. People emerged from shops and homes to watch the procession. Some faces showed satisfaction, others concern, misses. Campbell stood outside the courthouse, her expression thunderous. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "Indian troubles up north, ma'am," Blackwood said with false politeness. "Just bringing him in for questioning, as is proper. My husband is in the territorial capital for 2 days and you pull this, Mrs. Campbell's eyes flashed. "Mark my words, Silas Blackwood. There will be a reckoning." They locked Joseph in the jail's single cell. Sheriff Watson looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. "Just until we sort this out," he told Margaret weakly. "I'm sure it's nothing." But Margaret could read the mood of the gathering crowd. This wasn't about raids 300 miles north. This was about punishing a man who'd dared to cross the racial divide, who'd shown up their Christian charity with his heathen kindness. That night, leaving Thomas with Adelaide Morrison despite her friend's fears, Margaret crept to the hollow tree. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, she found Joseph's most precious possessions, his mother's beaded necklace, a Bible that must have been his father's, and a letter. Her hands trembled as she read his careful script. "Margaret, if you find this, it means what I feared has come to pass. They will not let me live long in their jail. Do not grieve. I have known for months this was likely. Every day of freedom, every moment watching you and Thomas find joy again, has been worth whatever comes. In the Bible, you will find papers, proof of my land ownership, bought legal and proper. It is yours now. Take Thomas somewhere far from here, where hearts are less hard. Remember, you offered your body for bread, but I wanted your heart. You gave it freely, and that has been my greatest treasure. Live well. Teach Thomas to be strong but gentle, like his mother. All my love. Joseph." Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming. No, she would not let him sacrifice himself for their prejudice, not while she drew breath. Racing back to town, she found chaos. A mob had gathered at the jail, torches blazing. Blackwood stood at the front, working them into a frenzy with talk of Indian savagery, of protecting white womanhood, of taking justice into their own hands. Sheriff Watson stood on the jailhouse steps, rifle in hand but vastly outnumbered. "Now, folks, let's not do anything rash. Step aside, Sheriff," Blackwood commanded. "This is citizens' justice. This is murder." Margaret pushed through the crowd, the precious bundle clutched to her chest. "Joseph Standing Bear has done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" Fletcher, his hand still bandaged, spat toward her. "He's corrupted a decent widow, turned her into a squaw." The slap of Margaret's hand across his face echoed in the sudden silence. "The only corruption here is in your hearts." She turned to address the crowd. "Desperate. This man saved my child from starvation. He protected us from harm. His only crime was showing Christian kindness when Christians would not. Pretty words from a woman who's forgotten her race." Someone shouted. "I've forgotten nothing." Margaret's voice rose above the crowd. "I remember my husband working himself to death trying to make a life here. I remember begging for help to feed my child and being turned away. I remember being so desperate I was willing to—" She stopped, then forced herself on. "I was willing to sell myself for bread." Joseph Standing Bear could have taken advantage. Instead, he gave freely and asked nothing in return. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the women looked uncomfortable, remembering their own cold rejections of her pleas. "He asked for one thing," Margaret continued, her voice breaking. "He said he wanted my heart, not my body, my heart. And do you know what? He earned it. With kindness, with protection, with treating me as a human being deserving of dignity. That's his crime in your eyes, treating a desperate widow as more than an object of charity or lust." The mob wavered, but Blackwood rallied them. "Listen to her. She admits it. She's given herself to this savage." I've given him nothing he didn't earn with honor, Margaret interrupted. And if loving a good man makes me a traitor to my race, then I choose love over your hatred any day. The words hung in the air like a challenge. In the distance, thunder rumbled. The spring rains Joseph had been preparing for, as if heaven itself prepared to weep. The storm broke with sudden violence, sheets of rain dousing torches and scattering the less committed members of the mob. But Blackwood and his core supporters pressed forward, using the chaos as cover to rush the jail. Sheriff Watson fired a warning shot, but he was quickly overwhelmed and disarmed. No! Margaret fought to reach the jail entrance, but rough hands held her back. She could only watch in horror as men smashed through the door with a wooden beam. Inside the cell, Joseph stood calmly, as if he'd been expecting this moment. His eyes found Margaret's through the crowd, and in them she saw not fear but sorrow, not for himself, but for what she was about to witness. "Drag him out," Blackwood commanded. "We'll show everyone what happens to savages who don't know their place." But as the first men entered the cell, Joseph moved. Even with his hands bound, he was formidable. His shoulder caught one attacker in the stomach, doubling him over. A knee to another's face sent him reeling backward. For a moment, it seemed he might actually fight his way free. Then a rifle butt caught him across the temple, and he went down hard. The mob swarmed over him, boots and fists falling like rain. Margaret screamed, fighting desperately against those who held her, but she might as well have fought the mountains. They dragged Joseph out into the storm, blood running from numerous cuts, one eye already swelling shut. Someone had brought a rope. The old cottonwood at the center of town, the hanging tree that had seen its share of frontier justice, stood waiting. "Stop this madness!" Adelaide Morrison pushed through the crowd, other women behind her. "This is murder!" "It's justice!" Blackwood snarled, fashioning a noose with practiced hands. "Stand aside, women, or share his fate." Thunder crashed overhead, lightning illuminating the scene in stark, terrible clarity. Joseph, on his knees in the mud, looked up at Margaret one last time. His split lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear over the storm, but understood anyway. "Be strong." Then, through the rain and chaos, came the sharp blast of a cavalry trumpet. Make way in the name of the United States Army." A company of cavalry thundered into the square, led by a captain whose uniform bore the insignia of Fort Laramie. Behind him rode Judge Campbell, soaked but stern-faced, and with them, Margaret's heart leaped. A group of Native Americans in traditional dress. "Stand down immediately," the captain commanded, his men forming a barrier between the mob and their intended victim. "By order of the territorial governor, this lynching is prohibited." "You have no authority here," Blackwood protested, but his voice had lost its certainty. "I have all the authority I need," Judge Campbell said, dismounting despite the rain, "including warrants for the arrest of Silas Blackwood, Hiram Fletcher, and 4 others for conspiracy to commit murder." "This is outrageous!" Fletcher started forward, but stopped when several carbines swung his way. "What's outrageous?" the judge continued. "Is that I can't leave for 2 days without you reverting to barbarism." He gestured to the Native Americans. "These are representatives of the Cheyenne Nation. They've come to testify that the recent raids were committed by white men disguised as Indians, criminals trying to stir up violence for their own profit." A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. One of the Cheyenne leaders stepped forward, his dignity unmarred by the rain. "Joseph Standing Bear is known to us," he said in accented but clear English. "He has walked the peace road between our peoples. To harm him is to harm that peace." The captain helped Joseph to his feet, cutting his bonds. "Mr. Standing Bear, on behalf of the Army, I apologize for this treatment. We've been investigating the false raids for weeks. Your assistance in maintaining peace between the settlements and the tribes has been noted and appreciated." Joseph swayed but remained upright, his good eye finding Blackwood. "You wanted so badly for me to be savage," he said quietly. "But which of us stands here with rope in hand?" Margaret broke free from her captors, No one tried very hard to stop her now, and ran to Joseph. She caught him as his knees buckled, supporting his weight as best she could. "I've got you," she whispered. "I've got you." "Take him to Doc Harrington," Judge Campbell ordered. "And clear this square. Anyone still here in 5 minutes will be arrested for unlawful assembly." The crowd dispersed quickly, shamed by the judge's words and the cavalry's presence. Some slunk away into the rain. Others murmured apologies they'd never have voiced an hour earlier. Blackwood and his conspirators were led away in irons, their protests drowned by thunder. At the doctor's office, Margaret refused to leave Joseph's side as Doc Harrington cleaned and stitched his wounds. The old physician, who'd delivered Thomas and tended James in his final illness, worked with gentle efficiency. "You're lucky," he told Joseph. "Lots of cuts and bruises. Maybe a cracked rib or two, but nothing that won't heal." "Lucky," Joseph repeated with bitter humor. "Luckier than you might have been," the doctor said pointedly. He glanced at Margaret. "This woman's courage bought time for help to arrive. Half the town's talking about her speech." "Half the town wanted to hang him," Margaret said bitterly. "True, but the other half didn't. That's progress, slow as it might be." Doc Harrington finished his work and washed his hands. "He'll need rest and care. I suppose you'll see to that. Mrs. Sullivan?" Margaret lifted her chin, daring him to object. "Yes, I will." The doctor studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. About time someone in this town remembered what Christian charity actually looks like." They returned to Margaret's cabin as dawn broke, the storm having washed the world clean. Joseph insisted he could ride, though Margaret walked beside his horse, ready to catch him if he fell. Thomas waited on the porch with Adelaide, his small face streaked with tears of relief when he saw them coming. "Mr. Joseph!" The boy flew to them, wrapping his arms around the warrior's legs as he dismounted. "I thought they killed you." Joseph placed a gentle hand on Thomas's head. "Not yet, little warrior, not yet." Inside, Margaret settled Joseph by the fire, while Adelaide helped brew willow bark tea for his pain. The women exchanged meaningful looks, Adelaide's acceptance of the situation speaking volumes about how the night's events had shifted perspectives. "I should go," Adelaide said finally. "But Margaret, be careful. Blackwood has friends, and hate runs deep." After she left, Margaret found herself alone with Joseph for the first time since the ordeal. She knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers, noting the scraped knuckles. The rope burns on his wrists. "You were ready to die," she said, not quite a question. "To keep you safe, yes." His good eye focused on her with intensity. "Always." "That's not what I want," Margaret said fiercely. "I don't want a martyr. I want—" She stopped, suddenly uncertain. "What do you want?" Joseph asked softly. Margaret thought of all the careful boundaries she'd maintained, all the proprieties she'd clung to even as their hearts grew entangled. They seemed foolish now, in the face of how close she'd come to losing him. "You," she said simply. "I want you, alive, here, with us." Joseph's hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Margaret, I know what the world says we can't have." She interrupted. "I know what it would mean, choosing this—" "The hatred won't stop. We'd have to leave, find somewhere new. But Joseph, He silenced her with the gentlest kiss, barely a brush of lips, mindful of his cuts. When he pulled back, his expression was wonder mixed with pain. "You offered your body for bread," he murmured. "I said I wanted your heart. I never dreamed you would give it so completely." "You earned it," Margaret whispered back. "With every kindness, every sacrifice, my heart is yours, if you'll have it. And mine yours." Joseph replied, "Whatever comes." Thomas, who'd been pretending to sleep, suddenly bounced up. "Does this mean Mr. Joseph is staying, forever? Despite everything?" Margaret found herself laughing. "We'll see, sweetheart, we'll see." Outside, the sun broke through the last of the storm clouds, painting the rain-washed world in gold. It felt like a promise, fragile but real. The confrontation at the jail had shown the worst of humanity, but also hints of the better angels. Adelaide's courage, the doctor's acceptance, Judge Campbell's justice, even the cavalry's intervention. Change would come slowly to places like Cedar Ridge, but it would come, one heart at a time, one act of courage building on another. And in a small cabin at the edge of town, two souls from different worlds had found something worth fighting for, not just love, but the hope of a future where such love might flourish openly. Joseph reached for the Bible he'd left in the hollow tree, which Margaret had brought back. He opened it to reveal the papers inside. Not just the deed to his land, but something else, a marriage certificate, already prepared, lacking only signatures and witnesses. "I bought this weeks ago," he admitted. Hope or foolishness, I don't know which. Margaret traced the elegant script with wondering fingers. It was dated before the mob came for him. He'd been planning not for death, but for life, for a future together. "Hope," she said firmly. "Definitely hope." As morning light filled the cabin, they sat together, wounded but not broken, uncertain of tomorrow but sure of each other. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and new. And sometimes, Margaret thought, that's all anyone could ask for, a clean start and someone to share it with, no matter what the world might say. The days following the attempted lynching passed in a strange calm, like the hushed silence after thunder. Margaret tended to Joseph's wounds with gentle hands, watching the bruises fade from purple to yellow. The cuts knit themselves closed. He bore it all with stoic patience, though she sometimes caught him wincing when he thought she wasn't looking. They had moved him to the small lean-to attached to her cabin. Propriety demanded that much, though the gesture felt hollow after she'd declared her love before half the town. Still, Margaret was determined to give the gossips as little ammunition as possible while Joseph healed. Thomas had appointed himself Joseph's guardian, bringing him water, sitting by his bedside practicing the Comanche words he'd learned, reading aloud from his primer. The sight of the boy carefully sounding out words while Joseph listened with grave attention made Margaret's heart ache with a sweetness almost too sharp to bear. "The brave knight protected the princess," Thomas read slowly, finger following the text. "Protected," Joseph corrected gently. "You're doing well, little scholar." "Was my papa brave?" Thomas asked suddenly. Setting the book aside, Joseph glanced at Margaret, who had paused in her sewing. "Tell me about him." Joseph said. Thomas scrunched his face in concentration. "He was tall. He smelled like wood shavings and pipe smoke. He used to carry me on his shoulders." The boy's voice dropped. "I don't remember much else." "Then he was brave," Joseph said firmly. "It takes courage to build a life in a new place, to raise a family. Your father did both. Are you brave?" "Some say foolish rather than brave." Joseph replied with a slight smile. "Mama says you're the bravest man she knows." Thomas announced, then looked puzzled when both adults seemed suddenly very interested in other things. That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep, Margaret sat with Joseph on the small porch, watching stars emerge in the clear spring sky. The marriage certificate lay on the small table between them, a question neither had directly addressed since that morning after the mob. "I've been thinking," Margaret said finally. "Dangerous habit," Joseph murmured, earning a gentle swat to his arm. "I'm serious. Judge Campbell would marry us. So would Reverend Dawson. Surprisingly, Adelaide says he was horrified by the mob." She twisted her hands in her lap. "But Joseph, I need you to understand what you'd be choosing. It's not just me and Thomas. It's a lifetime of stares, of whispers, of people who'll never accept us. Our children," she stopped, flushing at the presumption. "Our children," Joseph continued calmly, "would be strong. They would know both worlds, belong to both, even if welcomed by neither." He turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I have been alone since my sister died, not just without family, alone in my soul. Then I saw you that night, desperate enough to offer everything, strong enough to survive when I refused. I knew then. Knew what? That the Creator had not forgotten me after all. He took her hand, tracing the calluses from years of hard work. I don't offer you an easy life, but I offer you all of myself, my protection, my devotion, my love. If that's enough, it's everything, Margaret interrupted. But I want to give you the same, not just my need, but my strength too. Partners, equal in all things. Joseph's rare smile transformed his stern features. The whites won't understand that. They'll see you as degraded, me as presumptuous. Then they'll be wrong, as they've been wrong about so many things. A coyote called in the distance, answered by another. The night was alive with spring sounds, frogs from the creek, an owl hunting, the rustle of new leaves in the breeze, life continuing, regardless of human prejudices. I want to show you something, Joseph said suddenly. He rose, moving carefully but steadier than he'd been even yesterday. Can you get Thomas? We'll need the wagon. Curious. Margaret woke her son and hitched their old mule to the rickety wagon. Joseph directed them north, away from town, into hills she'd never explored. The moon was bright enough to light their way, turning the landscape into silver and shadow. After an hour's travel, Joseph had them stop at what seemed like an unremarkable valley. But as they climbed down, Margaret gasped. Hidden by the hills was a paradise, a meadow fed by a natural spring, surrounded by cottonwoods and aspens, even by moonlight. She could see the richness of the grass, hear the music of running water. This is my land, Joseph said quietly. Bought legal, like I told you, 600 acres. Good water, sheltered from storms. He pointed to a flat area near the spring. I thought to build there, a real house, not a cabin, room for a family. Margaret turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. It was perfect, isolated enough for privacy, but only an hour from town for supplies. The land was good. She could see it even in darkness. Vegetables would grow in that soil. Cattle would thrive on that grass. When? She asked. I started buying it piece by piece 2 years ago. Every fur I traded, every horse I broke, it went to this. He looked almost shy. I told myself it was just good business, but I think maybe I was preparing for you before I knew you existed. Thomas had run off to explore, his excited voice carrying back as he discovered the spring. Margaret moved closer to Joseph, sliding her arm around his waist carefully, mindful of his ribs. Show me where the house will be, she said. They walked the property together, Joseph painting word pictures of his vision. A main room with real glass windows facing the sunrise, a kitchen with a proper stove and room for a big table. Bedrooms, plural, he emphasized with a meaningful look. A barn for horses. A smokehouse. Maybe eventually a small mill powered by the creek. It's ambitious, Margaret said. Too ambitious. She thought of their small cabin in town, always cold, never quite keeping out the rain. Thought of Thomas growing up surrounded by people who would always see him as the son of that woman who married a savage. Thought of the children she and Joseph might have, caught between worlds. Then she thought of this place, this haven Joseph had carved out of wilderness and dreams, a place where they could build something new, undefined by others' expectations. Not ambitious enough, she declared. I want a garden too, a big one, and chickens, maybe pigs. Joseph's laugh rumbled through his chest. A farmer's wife, then? A rancher's wife. She corrected. This land was made for cattle and horses, tough Indian ponies crossed with good American stock. We could build something here. Joseph, something lasting. We, he repeated, as if tasting the word. I like the sound of that. Thomas came running back, soaked to the knees from the spring, clutching something in his fist. Look! Arrowheads, real ones. Joseph examined the boy's find with interest. Very old. Maybe my mother's people, maybe older. This has been a good place for a long time. Will we live here? Thomas asked hopefully. All of us? Margaret and Joseph exchanged looks. So much still stood between dream and reality. The marriage itself, the town's reaction, the sheer work of building a life from scratch. But standing there in their secret valley, with spring water singing and stars witnessing, it all seemed possible. "Would you like that?" Margaret asked her son. "Yes. Can Mr. Joseph teach me to ride and hunt and speak Comanche?" "If we do this," Joseph said seriously to the boy, "I won't be Mr. Joseph anymore. I'll be your father. That's a big change. Are you ready for that?" Thomas considered this with 7-year-old gravity. Then he nodded firmly. "My first papa is with the angels. Mama says he watches over us. I think—" He paused, working through the thought. "I think he would want us to have a new papa, someone brave who takes care of us." Margaret had to turn away, overwhelmed by tears. Joseph's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm. "Then yes," he told Thomas, "we'll live here, all of us." The ride back was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Thomas fell asleep against Joseph's shoulder, worn out by excitement. Margaret drove the wagon, sneaking glances at the two of them, her son and this man who'd chosen them as surely as they'd chosen him. As they neared town, Joseph stirred. "There will be trouble," he said quietly. "Blackwood has friends, and hatred runs deep. They'll try to stop us. Are you trying to frighten me away?" "Never, but you should know what you're facing. Mixed marriages are legal, but that doesn't make them welcomed. We might have to leave the territory entirely." Margaret thought of the valley, their secret place of possibility. "Then we'll build something worth staying for, something worth fighting for. Let them come." Joseph's hand covered hers on the reins. "You offered your body for bread," he said softly. "But I knew even then you were offering your heart. That's what I wanted, not for a night or a season, but forever." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now I know you're offering your strength too, your courage, your faith in what we could build together." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I am the richest man in the territory." They reached her cabin as dawn was breaking. Thomas woke enough to stumble inside to his bed. Margaret and Joseph stood on the porch, reluctant to part even for the few hours until full daylight made visiting proper again. "When?" Joseph asked, gesturing to the certificate. "As soon as you're healed, as soon as we can arrange it." Margaret smiled, feeling reckless and sure. "Unless you're having second thoughts about marrying a stubborn widow with grand plans and a son who asks too many questions." "Never," Joseph said firmly. "Though you might have second thoughts about marrying a half-breed trader with more dreams than sense and a tendency to attract lynch mobs." "Never," Margaret echoed. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" "We are," Joseph agreed. "And that, my heart, is exactly why this will work." As the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Margaret felt something settle in her chest. Not just love, though that was there in abundance, but certainty. The road ahead would be hard, the obstacles real, the price perhaps higher than either of them could imagine. But they would pay it together and build something new in the paying. A life not defined by the narrow boundaries others would draw, but by the breadth of their own courage and the depth of their commitment. In the growing light, Joseph's hand found hers one more time before he retreated to the lean-to for propriety's sake. And Margaret stood on her porch, watching the town wake up, no longer afraid of what the new day might bring. The day of decision arrived with thunderheads building on the horizon, as if the sky itself reflected the tension in Cedar Ridge. Joseph had healed enough to ride, and Judge Campbell had agreed to perform the marriage ceremony that afternoon. But as Margaret prepared her best dress, the blue one she'd worn to James's funeral, now transformed with new lace Adelaide had given her, she could feel the town holding its breath. "Mama, you look beautiful," Thomas said, watching her pin up her hair. He wore his Sunday clothes, face scrubbed clean, eyes bright with excitement. "Thank you, sweetheart." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she fastened her mother's cameo at her throat. Through the window, she could see people gathering in the street, not a mob this time, but curious onlookers waiting to witness this unprecedented union. Joseph arrived at noon, and Margaret's breath caught. He wore a mix of his two worlds, a proper suit coat over traditional leggings, his long hair neatly braided with an eagle feather. The bruises had faded, leaving only the quiet dignity that had first drawn her to him. "Ready?" he asked, extending his hand. "Ready," she affirmed, taking it. They walked through town together, Thomas between them, heads high despite the stares and whispers. Some faces showed disgust, others curiosity. A few, surprisingly, approval. "Mrs." Campbell nodded from her porch. Doc Harrington tipped his hat. Even some who'd stood with the mob now looked away, shamed by their actions. But at the courthouse steps, a final obstacle waited. Silas Blackwood might be in jail awaiting trial, but his brother Ezra had taken up the cause. He stood with a dozen men, blocking the entrance. "This abomination ends here," Ezra declared. "No mixing of blood will be sanctified in our town." Sheriff Watson stepped forward, badge glinting. "Judge's orders are clear. Ezra, stand aside. Or what? You'll arrest us all." Ezra spat tobacco juice near Joseph's feet. "This savage bewitched a decent woman. We're saving her from damnation." Margaret felt Joseph tense, ready to fight if needed. But she squeezed his hand and stepped forward herself. "Mr. Blackwood," she said clearly, "I appreciate your concern for my soul, but I've found more Christianity in this savage's actions than in all your brother's preaching. Now stand aside, or explain to Judge Campbell why you're obstructing justice." "You dare." "I dare," Margaret interrupted. "I dare to choose love over fear. I dare to judge a man by his heart, not his blood. I dare to build a life with someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession or a charity case." She looked at each man in turn. "What I don't dare is let small minds and smaller hearts dictate my future." Adelaide Morrison emerged from the crowd, followed by several other women. "She's made her choice," Adelaide said firmly, "and it's a braver choice than any of us have made. Step aside, gentlemen." For a moment, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Then Judge Campbell's voice boomed from the courthouse door. "Unless you all want to join Silas in jail, I suggest you disperse. Now." Grudgingly, Ezra's group parted. As Margaret, Joseph, and Thomas climbed the steps, someone in the crowd started clapping slowly. Then another joined, and another. Not everyone, perhaps not even most, but enough to show that change, however slow, was possible. The ceremony itself was simple. Judge Campbell spoke words about love transcending boundaries, about the courage to forge new paths. Thomas stood as witness alongside Adelaide and, surprisingly, Captain Reynolds from Fort Laramie, who'd stayed to ensure no further violence. "Do you, Margaret Sullivan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Judge Campbell asked. "I do," Margaret said, her voice strong and clear. "Do you, Joseph Standing Bear, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Joseph replied, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "Then, by the power vested in me by Wyoming territory, I pronounce you husband and wife." Their kiss was gentle, mindful of the watching crowd, but in it was a promise of all the tomorrows they would face together, as they signed the certificate, making it legal and binding. Judge Campbell leaned close. "You've chosen a hard road," he said quietly. "But then, the easy roads rarely lead anywhere worth going." Outside, the crowd had grown. Some shouted congratulations, others turned away in disgust. But Margaret noticed something else. Younger faces watching with interest rather than horror, as if seeing possibilities they hadn't imagined before. "Where will you go?" Adelaide asked, embracing Margaret tearfully. "We have a land north of here," Margaret replied. "We'll build something new." "You'll be missed," Adelaide said, then added more quietly. "You've made us all think. Margaret, made us examine ourselves. That's not comfortable, but it's necessary." They loaded their few possessions onto the wagon that afternoon. The cabin that had been Margaret's refuge in prison would shelter another struggling family. Everything worth keeping fit in 3 boxes and 2 worn carpet bags. As they prepared to leave, unexpected visitors arrived. The Cheyenne delegation that had helped save Joseph approached on horseback. Their leader dismounted, offering Joseph a decorated blanket. "For your new beginning," he said in Comanche, which Joseph translated for Margaret. "The pattern tells of two rivers joining to become stronger than either alone. We are honored." Joseph replied in the same language, accepting the gift with ceremony. The leader looked at Margaret appraisingly, then spoke in English. "You have chosen a difficult path, white woman, but Standing Bear is a good man. He bridges worlds. Perhaps you will too." As the delegation departed, other gifts appeared, practical ones from those brave enough to show support. Mrs. Campbell brought preserves and seed packets. Doc Harrington contributed medical supplies. Even the schoolteacher, who'd barely acknowledged Margaret for months, offered primers for Thomas. But the most surprising gift came from Sheriff Watson. He approached as they were securing the last items, looking uncomfortable. "I failed you," he said simply. "Failed my duty that night at the jail. This doesn't make up for it, but—" He handed Joseph a Winchester rifle. "Man needs to protect his family, especially heading into unsettled country." Joseph accepted the weapon gravely. "Thank you." Watson turned to Margaret. "Your husband, James, he was a good man. I think he'd understand. Want you happy." Margaret blinked back tears. "Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know." As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they were ready. Joseph helped Margaret onto the wagon seat, then lifted Thomas up beside her. The boy clutched their marriage certificate like treasure, appointed himself its guardian. "Take a last look," Joseph said gently. "We may not see this place again for a long time." Margaret gazed at Cedar Ridge, this town that had been both haven and hell, where she'd lost one life and found another. The church steeple caught the dying light. The general store's windows glowed amber. Some people watched from porches and windows, their faces unreadable in the distance. "I've seen enough," she said finally. "Let's go home." Joseph clicked to the horses. They'd traded the tired mule for a sturdy team, and the wagon rolled forward. Behind them, Cedar Ridge grew smaller, its judgments and restrictions fading with each turn of the wheels. The road to their valley was rough, barely more than a deer track in places. But as they climbed into the hills, Margaret felt weight lifting from her shoulders. Each mile took them further from others' expectations and closer to their own possibilities. "Tell me again about the house," Thomas requested, bouncing with excitement despite the jarring ride. Joseph smiled. He smiled more now. Margaret noticed, as if freedom had loosened something in him. 3 bedrooms to start, real wood floors, not dirt, windows facing east to catch morning sun, and a loft for me, if you want one, and a barn for horses and chickens and maybe a dog. All of that, Joseph assured him. But first, we build hard work ahead. "I'm not afraid of hard work," Thomas declared, then yawned hugely, making the adults laugh. As full dark approached, they reached their valley. Even in moonlight, it was magical, their secret place made real by legal deed and love's determination. Joseph had prepared a temporary camp near the spring, knowing they'd arrived too late to do more than rest. As they settled for the night, Thomas already asleep in his blankets, worn out by the day's emotions, Margaret and Joseph sat by their small fire, finally alone as husband and wife. "No going back now," Joseph said softly. "Would you want to?" Margaret asked. "Never. You." She moved closer, fitting herself against his side. "The day I offered myself for bread, I thought I'd reached the bottom, thought I had nothing left but desperation. But you saw something else. You saw strength I didn't know I had. You saw past my skin to my heart." Joseph replied, "That's a gift beyond price." They sat quietly, listening to night sounds, an owl calling, coyotes singing in the distance, the eternal whisper of the spring. This land would test them, Margaret knew. Building a life from scratch with the whole world watching, waiting for them to fail, would take everything they had. But sitting there under stars that seemed close enough to touch, with Joseph's arm around her and Thomas safe nearby, Margaret felt rich beyond measure. They had love, land, and the courage to forge something new. What more did anyone need? "I love you," she said, words that still felt wondrous to speak aloud. "And I love you," Joseph replied, "today, tomorrow, always." In the morning, they would begin the real work, clearing land, hauling stones for the foundation, starting the countless tasks that would transform Empty Valley into thriving home. There would be setbacks and sorrows along with the triumphs. Some in Cedar Ridge would never accept them. The world would challenge their children, their choices, their right to exist as a family. But tonight, in their hidden valley beneath Wyoming stars, none of that mattered. Margaret Sullivan had offered herself for bread in her darkest hour. Instead, she'd found a love that demanded not her body but her heart, and in giving it freely, she'd gained not just survival but a life worth living. As the fire died to embers, Joseph began to sing softly in Comanche, a prayer song, he'd told her once, for new beginnings. Margaret didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Tonight brought its own perfection. She thought of her words to the crowd. "I offered my body for bread, but he wanted my heart." That simple refusal had changed everything, transforming desperation into dignity, transaction into transformation. Now, as Joseph's song faded into the night and Margaret felt sleep claiming her, she knew the greatest truth of all. Sometimes the very thing we think will save us is what we need saving from. And sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, like a quiet warrior who sees past surface to soul, who offers not just sustenance, but sanctuary. Their story was just beginning. But already Margaret knew how it would end. Not with happily ever after. Life was too complex for fairy tales. But with something better, two people choosing each other daily, building something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows, proving that love could indeed conquer all, even prejudice, even fear, even the weight of a world that said they shouldn't exist. They existed anyway. And that, Margaret thought as stars wheeled overhead and her husband's breathing deepened beside her, was its own kind of miracle. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and redemption in the Old West. We'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share your location in the comments below so we can connect with listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier stories that touch the heart. What did you think of Margaret and Joseph's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one and love discussing these powerful stories with you.